A message meant for no one reached someone broken, altering 2 lives on one night. Margaret Chen was 62, recently widowed, still sending messages to her husband's old number, a quiet ritual she'd held on to for half a year. On the other end of that same number sat Jordan Mitchell, 28, alone in a dim apartment, spiraling through what felt like the worst night of their life. Margaret typed something she'd never dared to say out loud, something raw, meant only for the man she'd lost. And when Jordan read it, exhausted and unraveling, their reply carried more pain than they intended. What Margaret sent, and what Jordan wrote back, would ignite a chain of moments that neither of them could have seen coming. The story shifts here, almost like the tone of an old home recording, slower, softer, carrying the weight of a life lived with devotion. Margaret Chen had spent 40 years loving one man, David Chen, a partnership that felt less like a romance and more like a shared mission. They met as broke college kids who believed they could outrun the world if they just held on to each other tightly enough. And somehow they did. They built a tiny bakery from nothing, waking before dawn for decades, kneading dough and dreams side by side. They raised 2 sons who grew up watching their parents work, laugh, fight, forgive, and keep going in a way that made love look simple, even though it never was. Then, 8 months ago, everything ruptured. David collapsed from a sudden heart attack, and the life Margaret understood ended without ceremony, without warning, without the goodbye she'd rehearsed in her mind for years. Grief didn't arrive loudly. It seeped in, through empty chairs, through untouched slippers, through silence where a voice used to echo. And while everyone praised her strength, Margaret carried something darker inside her, something she'd never confessed to anyone, not even David. A secret shaped like guilt, one that gnawed at her every night and made her wonder whether she had failed the man she loved most. Her sons, busy with lives and families across the country, called when they could. They worried, but distance made their concern feel abstract. So Margaret lived alone in the house that still smelled faintly of flour and old laughter, wandering through rooms that seemed to whisper David's name. And every night, without exception, she performed the ritual that kept her anchored. She would sit on the edge of her bed, open her phone, and type a message to David's old number, small updates about her day, little fragments of her life that she wished he could witness. She never expected anyone to read them. In fact, the privacy of those unread messages was the only thing that felt safe. She believed she was sending her words into the void. That was the point, or so she thought. The tone shifts again, quicker, sharper, almost like flipping through a highlight reel stitched together from the fragments people share online. Jordan Mitchell's life looked deceptively curated from the outside. 28 years old, a non-binary graphic designer with a portfolio full of color and edge, they were the kind of person strangers might assume was thriving simply because their posts looked bright. But behind every filtered frame was a story that had been unraveling for years. 5 years earlier, when Jordan finally gathered the courage to come out to their conservative family, the rejection wasn't subtle. It wasn't a slow drifting apart. It was immediate, blunt, and devastating. One conversation shattered decades of belonging, and by the end of it, Jordan walked away carrying nothing but a suitcase, a portfolio case, and a silence that never really left them. Since then, they had built their life alone, relying on talent, grit, and whatever work they could find. They had moved to this new city with hope, real hope. A prestigious design firm had offered them a job, the kind of position they had dreamed about since they were a teenager doodling on the backs of school worksheets. For a moment, it felt like things were finally aligning. A stable income, a supportive partner, and the faint promise of a life that wasn't held together by fear. But 3 months into the job, everything cracked. Their supervisor called them into a meeting, smiled too politely, and explained they were being let go due to budget cuts. The words were clinical, sanitized. The truth, however, lurked beneath the surface. Jordan had overheard the comments. They had seen the way certain coworkers flinched around them. They sensed the real reason, but discrimination is rarely served directly. It comes wrapped in excuses that leave no trail. Then came the breakup, 3 weeks before this night. A long-term partner who said they needed someone less complicated, as if authenticity were a burden instead of a basic right. That relationship had been Jordan's last tether to emotional safety, and when it snapped, everything else followed. Now they lived in a tiny studio apartment barely big enough to turn around in. Rent swallowed almost everything they made from small freelance gigs. Meals became optional, sleep became scattered, and hope, once fragile, became non-existent. On this night, everything converged. The loneliness, the job loss, the breakup, the unhealed wounds from family who still pretended Jordan didn't exist. It all formed a heavy, suffocating fog. Jordan sat at their small desk, the one wobbly leg propped up with folded cardboard, and wrote 3 letters, one to their estranged parents, one to their ex, and one to no one in particular. They weren't dramatic. They weren't angry. They were quiet goodbyes written by someone who truly believed they had run out of reasons to stay. Then Jordan stepped onto their balcony 15 floors above the street. The city lights below looked distant, indifferent, and for a moment they believed that if they disappeared, no one would notice. No one would ask, no one would care. But before they could take another step, something broke the silence behind them. Their phone buzzed, just one vibration, soft, almost insignificant. The kind of notification most people ignore without thinking. But Jordan froze, because when someone is standing on the edge, literally or metaphorically, tiny things can become lifelines. That sound pulled them a fraction back into themselves, enough to make them hesitate, enough to make them turn around, enough to make them walk back inside. They weren't expecting anything important, certainly not something that would matter. But the message waiting on their screen, it wasn't meant for them at all. And that accidental text, sent by a grieving woman to the man she had lost, would become the first thread in a connection neither of them knew they desperately needed. The moment that follows unfolds in real time, like breath fogging a wind, slow, fragile, trembling at the edges. Jordan steps inside, the night air still clinging to their clothes, their heartbeats still too fast, too loud. The phone buzzes again in their hand, as if insisting on being seen. They expect a spam notification, a promo, anything forgettable. But when they unlock the screen, the message waiting for them is long, intimate, and aching in a way that stops them cold. Margaret's words appear line by line, as if she had poured her heart into them only seconds ago. "David, I made your mother's dumpling recipe today. Burned the first batch like always. The kitchen still smells like home. I pretend you're just in the other room. Tomorrow is our anniversary, 41 years. I don't know how to do this without you." Jordan reads the message once, then again, and again, not because they don't understand it, but because it feels impossible. As if they're holding a piece of someone else's grief in their hands, something private that slipped through the cracks of the universe and landed in their lap by mistake. Their thumb hovers over the screen, frozen. Their mind barely registers the apartment around them. All they hear is the thudding reminder of where they were 2 minutes ago, standing on a balcony, believing no one would care if they vanished. And now this. A stranger's pain, raw and unfiltered. A stranger who is also barely holding on. Jordan sinks onto the edge of their bed, their knees weak in a way that has nothing to do with the height of the balcony. The message replays in their head like a whisper. "I don't know how to do this without you." For a moment, Jordan forgets about their own collapse, because Margaret's words feel like a mirror, different story, same breaking. Their internal monologue spirals through a quiet realization. Someone else is drowning tonight. Someone else is trying to survive a day they never wanted to face. Someone else is hurting so deeply they're texting the past just to breathe. The thought hits harder than anything has in weeks. It's the first time in a long time that Jordan feels a tug, small but undeniable, pulling them out of their own darkness. They stare at the screen until their vision blurs, until their hands begin to shake, not from fear, not entirely, but from the fragile sense that what they do next might matter. They wipe their palms on their jeans, inhale shakily, and open the message reply window. Their fingers tremble over the keyboard. Part of them wonders if they should ignore it. Let the woman think her words disappeared into the void, just as she intended. But another part, the part that heard that buzz and stepped back from the edge, refuses to stay silent. Jordan types slowly, pausing after almost every word, wanting to be gentle, wanting to be careful, wanting to honor the weight of what they just received. And finally, after 3 false starts and 1 deep breath, they send the message that forms the first fragile thread between 2 strangers. "I think you have the wrong number, but I'm so sorry for your loss. Your David sounds like he was wonderful, and for what it's worth, you made it through today. That counts for something." As the message leaves their phone, Jordan exhales, a shaky, uneven release, like their lungs are remembering how to work. For the first time all night, they aren't entirely alone. And neither is Margaret. Margaret stared at her phone as if the device itself had betrayed her, then laughed, a small, astonished sound that tasted like relief and shame mixed together. She had written to a number that belonged to a dead man, and for months had imagined those messages dissolving into silence. A reply at 2 in the morning felt impossible and somehow sacred. Her first reply was breathless, embarrassed, the way a person apologizes for revealing a private habit. "Oh my goodness, I'm so embarrassed." "But thank you, are you all right? It's 2 a.m. The words landed like a soft knock across a gulf neither of them expected to cross. Jordan answered with a hesitation the screen couldn't show, an ellipsis that lingered longer than normal, like someone fumbling for steady ground. They typed, deleted, typed again, then finally sent. "I'm going through something." It wasn't a confession. It was a pause that had weight. What followed next would break so many rules everyone learns about strangers on the internet. It was reckless and tender and the most human kind of lawbreaking. two strangers trading realness at the hour when facades fall away. Text by text, they began to map each other's edges. Margaret's grandmother instinct, softly territorial, impossibly immediate, kicked in like muscle memory. She didn't know Jordan's name, their pronouns, their life story, but she knew how worry sounded. Her next message was firm and warm in the same breath. Talk to me, whatever it is. There was no judgment, only an invitation that felt like someone opening the door when you expected it to remain closed. Jordan hesitated, then opened up in ways they had avoided with friends, with doctors, with family. Each line was an act of courage and exhaustion. I lost my job. We broke up 3 weeks ago. My family doesn't speak to me. And then the words that felt like dropping a heavy, awful stone into both their laps. I don't know if I want to keep going. They typed it plainly, the punctuation spare, as if understatement could make it less true. Margaret read that sentence and felt the floor tilt under her feet. Images, her own nights of raw grief, arrived sudden and precise. She could hear David's laugh in corners of memory, and the terror of being left without a map returned with a clarity that took her breath. Thought that someone else might choose an end in the middle of a night made every neuron in her body ache. Their conversation folded into itself, practicality meeting tenderness. Jordan explained how they had written 3 goodbye letters and had been standing 15 floors up, how the city felt too large for the smallness they were carrying. Margaret replied with shorter, steadier messages at first, the way someone who has held bodies and still remembers how to hold breath speaks. Don't do anything tonight. Please, tell me where you are. Tell me one small thing that makes you feel okay right now. Jordan wrote back with a detail as small as it was honest. My ex left my favorite mug on the counter. I keep convincing myself I don't miss them, but I miss the sound of us moving around each other in the morning. That sentence, mundane, human, changed the tone. It anchored them both. Minutes bled into the kind of hours that feel elongated because attention is a gift being given in full. They texted like people whispering across a church pew, like friends on a late-night hotline, like two humans learning to hold the same fragile object at once. Margaret offered simple, actionable things. Breathe with me, name 3 things in the room, don't make any decisions until morning. Jordan complied, fingers shaking but complying. And then came the moment everyone in the dark knows, when silence becomes dangerous and words must be measured to buy time. Margaret began to type a longer reply, careful, deliberate, each sentence chosen as if the right word could stitch someone back together. She wasn't composing a lecture, she was composing a lifeline. It took her 8 minutes to write, 8 minutes of quiet concentration, of fingers hovering, of a heart moving through memory to find language that could reach a stranger. The length of time mattered. Every second allowed Jordan to keep breathing, to ride out the impulse that had almost taken them. Every pause on Margaret's end was a concession to thoughtfulness, to the idea that being kind can be engineered into a sentence. When her message finally arrived, it was not long, but it was precise and full of the stubborn, worldly tenderness that has saved people before. Stay with me tonight. Tell me one thing you can smell. Hold on to that and tell me more. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Those 8 minutes, measured, painstaking, human, tilted the night. What had started as a wrong number became a conversation that bent the arc of 2 lives, pulling them back from edges they had both assumed were inevitable. Margaret's message arrived like the opening of a door she had kept locked for months, too ashamed to admit what lived behind it. Her words were slow, honest, and stripped of the polite masks people wear during daylight. She wasn't trying to be inspirational. She wasn't trying to fix Jordan. She was simply telling the truth, the kind that cost something to say. I need to tell you something, she wrote. Since David died, I haven't been the same. People think I'm coping because I bake or because I keep the house clean or because I smile when someone mentions his name. But the truth is I'm not coping at all. Jordan stared at the long message unfolding on their phone as if each line carved out a space inside their chest. My sons love me, but they're busy. They call when they can. They don't see how quiet this house gets. They don't see how dark it feels when the sun goes down. I walk around rooms that still feel like his, still smell like him, still wait for him, and I feel guilty every single day. Jordan blinked. Guilty about what? Margaret continued before they could ask. I haven't told anyone this, but I've been having thoughts I'm not proud of. Some nights I drive to the bridge, I park, I sit there, I don't get out, I don't jump, I just stare at the water and wonder how long grief is allowed to last. Jordan felt their lungs seize up. There was no drama in her words, just truth, a quiet, unbearable truth spoken by someone who had reached the end of pretending. For a full 10 seconds, neither of them typed. It wasn't silence, it was recognition. The kind of recognition that doesn't require eye contact or shared history, just 2 people standing in the same emotional storm. Jordan typed first, I thought I was the only one feeling like this. Margaret responded instantly, You're not. No advice, no false promises, just two syllables that felt like hands reaching out in the dark. That was the moment, the exact second, when the arc of both their nights shifted. Two strangers, bound by accident, suddenly understood they were not comforting a weaker person or opening up to a stronger one. They were equals. They were mirror images at different stages of breaking. Then Margaret sent the message that would anchor the next several hours. "Let's both get through tonight, just tonight, that's all we're promising, tomorrow will deal with itself." Jordan replied, "Just tonight." They didn't talk about forever. They didn't talk about healing or purpose or the future. They focused on the next few hours because that was all either of them could handle without collapsing. What followed was not dramatic. It wasn't profound in the obvious way. It was the kind of conversation that saves people precisely because it is ordinary, human, and alive. The hours began to pass. They talked about their favorite comfort foods, Margaret's dumplings, Jordan's childhood obsession with grilled cheese with too much butter. They laughed about the movies they secretly hated. Margaret confessed she never understood why people loved superhero films. Jordan admitted they cried at animated movies that weren't even sad. They talked about childhood dreams. Margaret once wanted to be a photographer but never told anyone because her parents said it wasn't practical. Jordan wanted to design book covers and still kept a folder of sketches they never showed clients. They traded small truths about the versions of themselves they had abandoned along the way. When the clock struck 3, Margaret asked, "If you weren't afraid of failing, what would you do tomorrow?" Jordan replied, "I'd email 3 design studios I admire. No cover letter, just courage." At 4, Jordan asked, "If David were here, what would he tell you right now?" Margaret replied, "He'd tell me to stop carrying everything alone." At 5, Jordan admitted they still sometimes reread old messages from their ex. Margaret told them that grief isn't linear, whether it's for the living or the dead. By 5:30, the tone of their words began shifting without either of them noticing. Something warm had replaced the terror. Not hope, not yet, but something gentler, something like breathing without effort. As the night thinned and the sky outside both their windows began to soften, their messages turned calmer, slower. Jordan found themselves smiling at Margaret's memory of David once burning a pan of dumplings so badly he nearly set off the fire alarm. Margaret laughed when Jordan said their worst design job was making a flyer for a dog groomer who insisted that all fonts be neon pink. The darkness didn't fully lift. Nights like this don't undo themselves, but the edge they had been standing on was no longer beneath their feet. Then, almost quietly, the shift happened, the moment when the sky pale enough to suggest morning made its presence known in both their apartments. And with that came a tone in the conversation neither had felt in months: warmth, the tiniest sliver of possibility. The night had not solved their problems, it had not erased their griefs or rebuilt their confidence, but it had done something far rarer. It had kept them alive, and with the first soft light of sunrise, something unfamiliar cracked open inside both of them. For the first time in a very long time, neither of them felt completely alone. Morning arrived quietly, slipping into their homes without ceremony, without asking permission. It was the kind of morning that didn't feel triumphant, it simply felt like survival. But survival, especially after a night like theirs, carried its own strange warmth. Margaret woke first. Normally, mornings were the hardest. She would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, bargaining with herself to move, to breathe, to do anything. But today felt different. Not light, not joyful, just different. The heaviness hadn't vanished, but it had shifted, redistributed into something she could carry without collapsing. She sat up slowly, aware of the unfamiliar feeling in her chest, the faintest desire to stand, to straighten the blankets, to put her feet on the floor. She surprised herself. She surprised the grief that had made a home inside her. There was no burst of energy, no cinematic revelation, just the smallest spark of readiness to face another hour. Across the city, Jordan startled awake in a studio apartment that felt slightly less suffocating than usual. For the first time in weeks, the balcony door was closed. They didn't remember shutting it, but there it was, latched, safe. A quiet defiance against the impulse that had nearly swallowed them the night before. On the desk, the 3 goodbye letters were gone. Jordan had thrown them into the trash sometime after sunrise, a decision made without drama, without tears, without the need for metaphor. They were simply scraps of a night they were no longer willing to surrender to. Then came the silence. The long, uncertain silence of a new day. 2 people who had saved each other's lives, just barely, sat in their separate homes asking the same unspoken question. Now what? Were they supposed to text again? Was last night a one-time miracle born of desperation? Would reaching out cheapen it or deepen it? The question lingered like a trembling heartbeat between them. For Margaret, the uncertainty was almost paralyzing. She made tea she didn't drink. She stood in the kitchen doorway staring at the empty chair where David used to read the morning paper. She replayed the night's messages in her head, feeling both foolish and brave. Part of her wondered if Jordan even remembered the conversation or if it had been a blur of panic. But the other part, small, stubborn, almost childlike, wondered if connection, even accidental, deserved a chance to breathe in daylight. At exactly 10:37 a.m., Margaret picked up her phone. Her hands shook, but this time not from fear, not entirely. She typed a message and stared at it, unable to press send. 3 full minutes passed while she battled every instinct that told her she was being ridiculous, intrusive, dramatic. But something stronger than fear nudged her forward, the memory of Jordan's trembling honesty, the echo of her own confession at the bridge, and the impossible fact that they had both made it through the night. Finally, she sent it. "We made it through the night. Coffee. There's a cafe on Maple Street. I promise I'm not a serial killer, just a lonely baker." The instant the message left her phone, Margaret felt a rush of vulnerability so sharp it made her sit down. She had opened a door and she had no idea what would walk through it, or if anything would at all. Jordan saw her message while brushing their teeth, the mint still tingling on their tongue. Their first reaction was disbelief. The second was a rush of warmth that felt dangerously close to hope. Coffee? A real meeting? Was that wise? Was that reckless? Was that exactly what they needed? Jordan sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the message for almost a full minute. Part of them whispered that this was too fast, too strange, that they shouldn't tether themselves to another fragile person. But another part, louder, steadier, remembered the words from last night, just tonight. And here they were, still alive in a new morning neither of them expected to see. Jordan typed back, fingers surprisingly steady. "I'm either very brave or very stupid, but yes, 2 p.m. Margaret laughed when she read it, a real laugh, the first one in months that hadn't felt forced. She typed a quick confirmation, then immediately panicked about what to wear, what to say, how to act. But beneath the nerves was something subtle but profound, anticipation. They went about their mornings separately, but there was an invisible thread between them now. Something steady, something fragile, something real. And neither of them knew that hours earlier, in the first quiet stretch of morning, both had done something they would never admit to each other, not yet. They had both Googled the same phrase, suicide prevention hotline. Both had hovered over the phone number, debating whether to call. Both had whispered not yet for different reasons. Both had decided to hold off because of the person on the other end of last night's messages. They didn't know this. They couldn't know this. But the truth hung in the background like a soft, persistent echo. Two people who almost slipped away had chosen to stay, because a wrong number had connected them at the exact moment they needed a reason. And now, with sunlight stretching across the city, they were about to meet for the first time. The hours between their messages and the meeting passed with a kind of nervous electricity neither of them had experienced in years. By the time the clock neared 2, both Margaret and Jordan were already on their way, too early, too anxious, too aware that this wasn't just coffee. This was something that didn't have a name yet but mattered far more than either would admit. The coffee shop on Maple Street was quiet, tucked between a florist and a barber shop, the kind of place where the air always smelled faintly of cinnamon. Margaret arrived first, 15 minutes early because she always arrived early. She wore a soft blue cardigan, a string of modest pearls, and her wedding band, which she still turned absent-mindedly with her thumb. Her hands trembled slightly, but it wasn't fear exactly. It was the weight of possibility. She took a seat by the window. Every time the bell above the door chimed, she looked up too quickly, too hopefully, then scolded herself for being ridiculous. What was she even expecting? That they'd fall into an easy conversation. That two people who had nearly disappeared from the world last night would suddenly know how to talk in daylight. Still, she stayed. Jordan approached the cafe at exactly 1:54 p.m. They'd changed outfits 3 times, first something casual, then something guarded, finally something honest, a vintage band t-shirt, black jeans, and their favorite jacket, the one covered in enamel pins they collected over the years. Their hair, dyed a gradient of turquoise and sea glass green, caught the light as they hesitated at the door. They almost turned around, twice. But then they remembered the closed balcony door, the thrown-out letters, the text, "We made it through the night," so they stepped inside. The moment they saw each other, the air shifted, not dramatically, not like a movie, but with a quiet jolt of recognition. Margaret sitting stiff as a schoolteacher on her first day, and Jordan trying not to look like they might bolt at any second. Two completely different worlds meeting in a space barely large enough to hold the gravity between them. Jordan walked toward the table with a cautious smile. Margaret stood up, smoothing her cardigan, unsure whether to wave or extend her hand or hug. She froze in the middle of all three and ended up doing none of them. They sat. And silence, thick, awkward, fragile, stretched between them. Jordan stared at their hands. Margaret stared at the table. Neither knew how to begin. Last night they had spoken about death, fear, loneliness, the deepest corners of themselves. But here, face to face, even hello felt perilous. Jordan took a breath, opened their mouth, then closed it again. The words wouldn't come. Margaret fiddled with the clasp of her purse. Her heart thudded. She had never felt more aware of how old she must seem, how formal, how out of place next to this vibrant, pierced, colorful young person. Finally, with the determination of someone choosing courage over comfort, Margaret cleared her throat and spoke first. I brought something, she said, voice unsteady but warm. Jordan blinked. You did. Margaret nodded and reached into her bag, pulling out a small container wrapped in a floral dish towel. She set it gently on the table, hands hovering as if unsure whether this gesture was silly or meaningful. I brought dumplings, she said. From yesterday, the ones I didn't burn. Jordan's breath caught. It was such a simple sentence, almost comically mundane, and yet it hit them like a wave. The effort, the tenderness, the shared history hidden inside that tiny offering. Margaret wasn't just bringing food. She was bringing a piece of her grief, her love for David, her ritual, her survival. Was saying, I trust you enough to share this. Jordan covered their mouth with their hand. A sound escaped, half a laugh, half a sob. You brought dumplings, they whispered as if naming something sacred, and then something unexpected happened. They both started laughing and crying at the exact same time, not politely, not quietly. The kind of messy, cathartic release that comes when two humans who were never meant to meet suddenly recognize each other's pain in broad daylight. Margaret's shoulders shook. Jordan wiped their eyes with the sleeve of their jacket. A barista glanced over and then politely pretended not to notice. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't dignified, but it was real. When the tears slowed and the laughter softened into something steady, they both exhaled at the same moment, long, trembling breaths that felt like surrender. Jordan leaned back, still sniffling. I don't know what the etiquette is for this kind of thing, they said. Do we start over, introduce ourselves? Pretend last night didn't happen. Margaret shook her head gently. No, she said. I think last night is the reason we're here. Jordan nodded. Yeah, I think so too. The tension dissolved, not completely, but enough for the first threads of something new to appear between them. And this is where the next chapter of their story truly began, because what they said to each other in the next 20 minutes would form the most unlikely friendship either had ever known. A friendship born not from convenience or similarity, but from survival, honesty, and the impossible luck of a wrong number that arrived at the exact right time. The conversation that unfolded across that tiny Maple Street table stretched far longer than either of them expected. What began with awkward smiles and trembling hands slowly warmed into something steady, something almost gentle. 4 hours passed without either of them noticing, stitched together by stories, confessions, and a surprising rhythm of connection neither had felt in a long time. What struck them both first was the sheer number of unexpected similarities, coincidences that felt too aligned to ignore. Margaret talked about her years in the bakery she and David built from scratch. How she treated dough like clay, flavor like color, pastries like small edible sculptures. Jordan listened with the fascination of someone who understood creation on a soul level. To them, Margaret wasn't just a baker. She was an artist who never gave herself permission to call it art. Jordan, in turn, shared how design had always been their language, how shapes and colors helped them express what words couldn't, how their dream as a kid was to illustrate cookbooks, to merge storytelling and food in a way that nourished the heart as much as the body. Margaret smiled at that, really smiled, because she recognized the longing behind it. She had lived her entire life creating beauty for others while hiding the part of her that wanted that beauty to mean something more. They moved through heavier territory too, both grieving, though their griefs wore different shapes. Margaret mourning a man who had been her anchor for 4 decades. Jordan mourning a family who had chosen the comfort of their beliefs over the truth of who their child was. 2 different losses, but the same hollow ache of being untethered. They also realized they were both hovering in the same question, one spoken softly between refills of coffee. What am I even doing with my life? For Margaret, it was the fear that her best years were behind her, that she was simply filling time until the next wave of grief knocked her down. For Jordan, it was the terror that no matter how hard they worked, their identity, their art, and their heart would always be judged before their talent. And buried beneath those fears was another shared truth. They were both secretly creative and deeply unfulfilled. Margaret confessed she always wanted to write down her recipes and stories, but never believed anyone would care. Jordan admitted they kept a private folder of designs inspired by food, culture, and memories, work they never showed clients because it felt too personal. Somewhere in the middle of their 4th hour, after the emotional weight had settled into something softer, Margaret leaned back, her eyes bright with a spark Jordan hadn't seen in her before. I have a crazy idea, she said. Jordan tilted their head, half amused, half curious. Should I be scared? Probably, Margaret replied, laughing. Then she lowered her voice, as though letting Jordan in on a secret she hadn't dared to speak aloud until now. She told them about her dream, tentative, fragile, but undeniably alive. A way to blend baking and storytelling. A way to transform memories into recipes, recipes into art, art into something that could make people feel connected instead of alone. She didn't know what shape it could take, not yet, but she wanted to create something with meaning, something worth waking up for. Jordan listened, leaning forward, pulse quickening in a way that felt almost like hope. They recognized the seed of possibility when they heard it. They recognized an idea that wanted to become something bigger than either of them. And Margaret, seeing that flicker in Jordan's eyes, continued. "I can bake," she said. "You can design. What if we did something together?" Jordan blinked. They had expected a soft suggestion, maybe a lunch invitation. Not this. Not collaboration. Not creation. Not the start of something that felt suspiciously like purpose. And here the narrator pauses, because neither of them understood the magnitude of what had just been planted across that small table. Her idea would eventually involve a business, a blog, and going viral, but neither of them saw that coming. They kept the promise they'd made that strange, soft morning, every Thursday, same cafe, same flimsy table by the window. It began as an experiment, two people seeing whether a single act of kindness could be repeated without falling apart. Within days, it became ritual. Within weeks, habit. Within months, a new constancy neither of them had in their lives before. The rhythm of their weeks began to organize itself around that small, steady appointment. Workdays blurred into tasks and obligations, but Thursday became sacred, a place to unload, to learn, to fail, and to try again. Their conversations carried the texture of real life, messy, slow, occasionally hilarious, and were stitched together with the small connective tissue of text messages that filled the days between meetings. Their story, in a sense, began to read like a thread of notifications, short, earnest, sometimes ridiculous, always human. Text from Jordan, week 1, 9:12 a.m. "Okay, I am terrified. Dumplings, I've never. What if I break your oven?" Text from Margaret, week 1, 9:14 a.m. "You can't break an oven. You can only burn dumplings. That's an art I will teach you." Week 1 was a beautiful disaster. Margaret insisted on teaching Jordan the dumplings she'd learned from David's mother, a recipe that required patience, hands that moved like choreography, and an intuition that had been honed over decades. Jordan arrived armed with curiosity and zero confidence. Flour ended up on the counter, on their shirt, even in a stray curl of Jordan's hair. Dough stuck, seals failed, and the first pan was a smoky, misshapen catalog of well-meaning mistakes. They laughed until their sides hurt. Margaret's patient voice guided, corrected, encouraged. Jordan, who had once believed they were only good at digital things, found themselves shaping dough like a sculptor discovering a new medium. Text from Jordan, week 2, 11:03 a.m. "Teach me to post one picture without making me cry, please." Text from Margaret, week 2, 11:05 a.m. "What's an Instagram?" Week 2 turned into a lesson in the new language of connection. Jordan became Margaret's reluctant but unsurprising teacher. They showed her how to frame a photograph, how to write a caption that wasn't just a grocery list, how to respond to comments without letting praise or criticism tilt her mood. Margaret learned to see her baking through a new lens, not only as sustenance, but as story. Jordan, who had been starved for real-life practice at communicating their art, found joy in translating Margaret's hands into images and words people could understand. They set up a simple account, a shared space that felt like a handshake between past and present. Text from Margaret, week 3, 7:22 p.m. "I keep saying David's name and it still sounds like a prayer." Text from Jordan, week 3, 7:25 p.m. "My mom still calls me by my dead name sometimes. It's like getting punched in the gut." Week 3 dug deeper. Margaret, who had been coy about the full weight of her grief, began to tell the stories she hadn't allowed herself to tell out loud. The small betrayals of everyday loss, the recipes that smelled like David's childhood, the tiny rituals that kept him present. Jordan, safer in Margaret's steady attention, unfolded their coming-out story in detail. How the family conversation had ended, the months of silence that followed, the nights of second-guessing. The cafe hummed around them, but their sentences were intimate and anchored. Grief met rejection, and in the meeting, recognition bloomed. They realized they weren't simply two wounded people sitting together. They were witnesses to each other's pain in a way that felt both sacred and ordinary. Text from Jordan, week 4, 3:40 p.m. "Bringing people. Your heads up. They're loud and brilliant and will probably embarrass you." Text from Margaret, week 4, 3:42 p.m. "Good. I like loud." "Bring them." Week 4 changed the geometry of their friendship. Jordan invited Margaret to meet a small constellation of people who had become chosen family. friends from drag shows and design gigs, activists, a tattoo artist who made consolation cups, a nurse who knitted hats for newborns. Margaret arrived with a pie and a nervous smile, unsure how a woman in pearls would fit in with glitter and dyed hair and slang she didn't know. The first 5 minutes were awkward, different vocabularies, different cultural reference points, but laughter became the bridge. Margaret shared stories about David that made Jordan's friends lean in. Jordan's people told Margaret about the brutal tenderness of chosen family. Soon, Margaret found herself saying something that surprised even her. "I've got room in my life for more children." No one was expecting that line, and it landed with the soft force of truth. It wasn't biological. It was a declaration of openness. The room warmed. People offered high fives and gentle teasing. Margaret's eyes shone when one of Jordan's friends asked if she'd ever consider teaching baking classes in community centers. Another suggested collaborating on a benefit bake sale. Margaret's life, once isolated and small, began to expand in real time. Text message transitions became their storytelling device, snapshots of growth and ordinary life. A text about a burnt batch would be followed by one about a tiny viral post, which would be followed by a text about an argument with a landlord or a midnight hour of designing a logo. These messages recorded the incremental nature of change, not heroic epiphanies, but steady, mundane efforts. By week 6, they'd renamed their joint social account. By week 7, a local food blogger had written a kind piece about the unlikely pair. By week 8, their relationship had shifted again. Phone calls started replacing texts. What had once been a lifeline of messages at 2 in the morning became a nightly check-in, short, private, necessary. And the narrator pauses to note the line that would become their compass. Small rituals saved them. Thursday meetings, text check-ins, shared failures, these things carved grooves in the days that made it harder to slip back into the old spirals. By week 12, the change had become almost domestic. Jordan's voice on the phone was a familiar cadence in Margaret's evenings. Jordan's clothes sometimes hung over Margaret's chair, left when they'd worked late on a community flyer. A set of mismatched mugs had migrated from Jordan's kitchen to Margaret's pantry. The calls that had once been lifelines began to sound like curtain calls at the end of days. Arguments, laughter, plans, mistakes, apologies. Jordan's calls were literally coming from inside Margaret's house sometimes, quietly, awkwardly domestic, a tenderness that neither of them had planned but both had become tenderly dependent upon. There was no single dramatic turning point. Instead, their lives braided together slowly, through flowered hands, shared passwords, group texts, and quiet admissions. The weekly ritual had begun as a promise to survive one night. It had become, unexpectedly, the architecture of a life both of them were willing to rebuild, together. Their lives, which had once been parallel lines of sorrow and small routines, suddenly bent toward one another in a way that felt inevitable and a little terrifying. When Jordan lost their apartment, evicted after a month of missed payments and a landlord who had no patience for late checks, what had started as a project, an experiment in kindness, became something much more urgent. Margaret made the offer before she'd fully thought it through. It came from a place of practicality and panic and a surprising reservoir of courage. "You can stay here. There's a spare room, for as long as you need." Jordan hesitated, then accepted. The decision was immediate and enormous. In a single afternoon, the tentative ritual of weekly meetings transformed into cohabitation. The first weeks of living together were, in one word, awkward. 2 generations learning to orbit the same small house stumbled through the mechanics of domestic diplomacy. Margaret, who had spent 40 years with David, had routines that read like sacred texts. Morning tea at 6, the radio at a low volume while she kneaded dough, the habit of turning off lights in a particular order. Jordan brought a different kind of order, playlists that jumped from lo-fi beats to riotous punk, a stack of sketchbooks, chargers for devices Margaret didn't recognize, and a comfort with chaos that both frustrated and charmed her. What followed was a humorous montage of culture clash moments that could have been a comedy sketch if their lives hadn't also held so much tenderness. Margaret discovered, mid-morning, that Jordan listened to music so loud and so modern it made her kitchen appliances vibrate. She peered into Jordan's room one afternoon to find them headbanging gently to a band she couldn't name, and she crossed herself with surprised delight. Jordan, for their part, learned that Margaret's idea of dancing was a careful, slow sway learned from decades in a warm bakery, until one evening Margaret, emboldened by wine and a stubborn desire to participate, tried a tick-tock move Jordan taught her. The result was a clumsy, glorious duet, Margaret's arms moving like dough being folded, Jordan's feet trying to keep up. They laughed until they cried. They argued about the thermostat like a sitcom couple. Margaret favored warmth, the kind that makes biscuits rise and bones feel safe, while Jordan preferred a cooler apartment that suited late-night creativity. They compromised awkwardly by draping an Afghan over the kitchen chair and keeping a fan in Jordan's room that hummed like a small, disgruntled animal. Language became both a barrier and a playground. Margaret, who spoke Mandarin at home and English in public, hummed old lullabies and called Jordan by endearments they hadn't heard since childhood. Jordan answered with Gen Z slang that at first sounded like a foreign dialect to Margaret. Low-key vibes, big yikes. They taught one another words. Margaret showed Jordan how to say, "come sit" in Mandarin. Jordan explained the subtle difference between lol and el mao. The house filled with both laughter and the soft clinks of learning. But amid the jokes and the adjustments, something deeper settled into place. The rooms that had once echoed with loneliness began to hold conversation again, real, unhurried, intimate conversation. Often the kitchen table became the late-night altar of their new life. They would sit for hours with tea or a hastily made grilled cheese, talking about the sort of things people only permit themselves to say when they're safe. Regrets, small humiliations, secret dreams, the minutiae of grief. Margaret spoke about the bakery's quiet seasons. Jordan talked about clients who critiqued their pronouns. They shared lists, books that had mattered, songs that felt like weather, recipes that smelled like home. Those late-night conversations carried the particular gravity of two people who had once been untethered, finding a rope to hold. They weren't trying to save one another so much as keep each other company through the slow, tedious work of being human. And then, in a moment that peeled back a fresh layer of Margaret's sorrow, Jordan discovered something that had stayed untouched in the house since the day David died. His study. It was an unremarkable discovery, a closed door at the end of a hallway, a brass knob that hadn't been turned in 9 months. Jordan noticed it because they were looking for a place to store sketchbooks, and the room's door stood quietly sentinel. When they opened it, the air that escaped was the kind of smell that archives memory: leather paper, the faint trace of tobacco and lemon oil. The desk was still arranged the way David had left it, a fountain pen in its holder, a pair of reading glasses beside a thick bookmarked book, a mug with a lipstick stain that Margaret always meant to clean and never did. Jordan stepped inside softly, as if the room might resent intrusion. They ran a hand over the back of a chair and felt a prickle of reverence. Papers lay in careful stacks. A calendar on the wall still had the last marked appointment penned in David's handwriting. Nothing had been moved. Nothing dared be altered. The study was a sealed capsule of before the ambulance, before the hollowing out, before the brittle silences that followed. When Jordan closed the door again, Margaret was standing in the doorway, a small, apologetic smile on her face. "I haven't been in there," she said simply, as if confessing a minor sin. Not since he left." The confession landed like an honest weight. Jordan realized, with a sudden, tender clarity, what a profound act it had been for Margaret to offer a spare room, how it was more than practical help. It was an unspoken permission to inhabit a life she had been clinging to for fear of disturbing the past. They sat down at the kitchen table, and for the first time since Jordan moved in, the conversation turned not toward laughter but toward the quiet business of being brave. Margaret talked about how the study had become a shrine and how in trying to protect David's things, she'd also protected herself from change. Jordan listened, and then in the softest way offered what they had, the bluntness of someone who had been forced to start over, who knew the shape of reinvention. "Maybe it's time," Jordan said, "to let a few things move, to make space for the new stuff." Margaret looked at the younger person across from her, their hair still flecked with flour from baking lessons, a smudge of charcoal on their thumb from a late-night sketch, and nodded slowly. The house hummed around them, a domestic choir of appliances and small noises, making a sound they both recognized now, the ordinary music of a life being rebuilt. Their days would keep stuttering and recalibrating. But in that house, under the low roof and between mismatched mugs, they had found a scaffold to hold themselves while they relearned how to live. And that, more than any dumpling, tick-tock, or thermostat truce, was the quiet miracle of moving in. The transformation of David's study didn't begin with a grand plan or a bold decision. It began with a quiet morning, sunlight sliding across the hallway floor, and Margaret standing in the doorway of the room she had avoided for nearly a year. Jordan stood beside her, not urging, not pushing, just offering presence. The kind of presence that makes something impossible feel almost manageable. Margaret touched the doorknob first. It felt cold, as though time had refused to warm it without David's hand. She inhaled a trembling breath and pushed the door open. The room greeted them with a stillness that felt alive. Dust motes floated in the air like suspended memories. Books lined the shelves in neat rows, his handwriting labeling categories. Papers sat untouched on the desk. A sweater draped over the back of the chair leaned as if he'd only stepped away for a moment. Jordan didn't speak. They knew instinctively that this was not a moment for commentary. Margaret stepped inside slowly, her hand brushing the edge of the desk where David had once tapped his fingers while thinking, where he had rested his elbows, where he had kissed her forehead on countless afternoons. She whispered, "I wasn't ready before." Jordan answered softly, "You are now." They began by opening windows, letting air circulate through a room that had been sealed in grief. Margaret handled every object with reverence, papers, pens, books, each one carrying a small shard of memory. Jordan helped by sorting stacks, wiping surfaces, handing Margaret items gently without interrupting her silent conversations with the past. Then, tucked inside a drawer of the desk, beneath envelopes and old receipts, Jordan found a collection of journals. Leather-bound, worn at the edges, filled with David's unmistakable handwriting. They handed one to Margaret. Her fingertips traced the cover. She opened to a page near the end. Her breath hitched, quiet but sharp. Jordan waited. Margaret read carefully, her voice shaking yet steady enough to be understood. He was writing about me," she swallowed, blinking rapidly. "About us." They moved to sit on the floor beside the window. The journal rested between them like a fragile truth. Margaret turned to the last entry, the ink slightly faded but still legible. She took a moment, gathering courage, then read aloud. "If you're reading this after I'm gone, Margaret, please don't stop living. I know you'll want to hide in the quiet, but don't. Find someone who needs you. You have so much love left to give. Let it find a place to land." Her voice broke on the final line. Jordan looked down, their own eyes burning. They whispered, he knew you, all of you." Margaret closed the journal slowly, pressing her palm against the cover as if to absorb the warmth of David's words. A soft sob escaped her, not the fractured, hopeless sobs of early grief, but a new kind, one made of release, revelation, and unbearable love. She looked at Jordan through tears that softened every edge of her face. "You know," she said, barely louder than a breath, "I thought losing him meant losing purpose. But maybe he led you to me. Maybe he knew I'd need someone to care for. Someone, too, to keep me alive." Jordan's throat tightened. "Maybe he knew I'd need you, too." It wasn't sentimentality, it wasn't fate, it was truth, two lives flung into one another's paths at the exact moment both were slipping away. Cleaning the room shifted after that. It wasn't an act of purging grief. It was an act of honoring it. They sorted David's books into those Margaret wanted to keep and those she wanted to donate. Jordan helped her pack old papers, preserving the most important ones. They folded the sweater carefully and placed it in a keepsake box. As the room emptied, something in Margaret's posture changed. There was space in her chest again, space for breath, space for possibility. When the study was finally clear, Margaret turned to Jordan with an unexpected steadiness. "I don't want this room to stay a shrine," she said. "I want it to be alive again." Jordan nodded, unsure what she meant until she opened the closet and pulled out a stack of blank canvases she had hidden years ago, purchased in a moment of bravery she never followed through on. She placed them on the desk. "Let's make this our space," she said, and Jordan understood. They brought in Jordan's sketchbooks and Margaret's baking tools, her grandmother's rolling pin, jars of spices she used like paint. They cleared the center of the room to make space for movement, for ideas, for creation. What followed became a montage of rebirth. There was Margaret experimenting with new dumpling shapes while Jordan sketched the angles of her hands. Jordan designing a logo for a future project neither of them had named yet, while Margaret shaped dough into delicate spirals. The two of them laughing when Margaret accidentally spilled flour on Jordan's freshly inked drawing, turning it into an accidental piece of mixed media art. Nights spent listening to music while trying new recipes. Afternoons spent debating color palettes, dawn creeping through the windows as they created side by side, the room filling with warmth instead of absence. The study, once sealed chamber of grief, became the heartbeat of the house. The space David left behind became the place they learned to live again. The business idea didn't arrive with fanfare. Slipped into their lives the same way everything else between them had, quietly, naturally, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon where Margaret was kneading dough on the kitchen counter and Jordan was sketching logos at the table. Jordan had been watching her hands work, the rhythm, the precision, the way she shaped dough like someone coaxing memory into form. They glanced at their sketchbook, then back at her, then at the growing pile of pastries cooling near the window. Something clicked, sudden and unmistakable. "You know," Jordan said, tapping their pencil against the page, "we could actually do something with this." Margaret looked up, confused. "With what, the dumplings?" "No," Jordan said, smiling, "with us." Margaret blinked, unsure if they were joking, but Jordan continued, energized now, ideas rising like steam from a boiling pot. "You bake like an artist," they said. And I design like a storyteller. What if we combine them, your recipes, my visuals, something new? Margaret wiped flour from her hands, wary but intrigued. I'm not running a bakery again, she warned gently. That was David's dream too. It hurts to imagine starting over without him. Jordan nodded. Not a bakery, something smaller, something that fits who you are now. They flipped their sketchbook around. On the page was a rough mock-up, a cake sliced open to reveal a handwritten message inside, something personal, delicate, surprising, a secret hidden beneath frosting and layers. Next to it, Jordan had scribbled a line in pencil. Wrong Number Bakery, stories you can taste. Margaret froze. The name alone made her chest tight in equal parts ache and wonder. Jordan continued, voice softer now. We could share one story with each order, not the whole thing, just the heart of it, how we met, how a wrong number became a lifeline. People love meaning, they love connection. And you make the kind of food that feels like memory. Margaret stared at the drawing. She imagined a cake holding a message of hope, a tart that carried a line from a stranger-turned-family member, a batch of dumplings folded around a secret of survival. Her hands curled around the edge of the counter as she considered the possibility of creating something new from the ruins of what she'd lost. I don't know, she began. I don't know if people would buy something like that. Jordan shrugged. Then we let them decide. We try it once. If it fails, but if it works. They didn't finish the sentence. They didn't need to. Margaret exhaled a long, trembling release. All right, she said quietly. Let's try. And that was the moment the bakery was born, not with a business plan or a marketing strategy, but with two people choosing to create rather than collapse. They spent the next week transforming David's former study into a studio. Jordan designed the logo, a simple phone icon shaped like a whisk with flour dust swirling around it. Margaret tested recipes, adjusting textures and flavors until each one felt like a small message in itself. They experimented with handwritten notes baked into edible sugar sheets, hidden between cake layers like whispers. Then they launched the Instagram account, at Wrong Number Bakery. The first post was a photo of a vanilla sponge cake with raspberry layers and a sugar ink message inside that read, "You mattered to me before I knew your name." In the caption, Jordan wrote a condensed version of how they met, tender, anonymous, not sensational, but deeply human. The comments were immediate and overwhelming. People didn't just want the cake. They wanted the story. Orders trickled in at first, friends of friends, neighbors, co-workers of Jordan's design clients. Each order came with a prompt. Write one sentence you wish someone had told you when you needed it most. Margaret baked the message in. Jordan designed the exterior. Together, they delivered something beautiful, surprising, and quietly profound. Then came the moment that changed everything. A young customer with a soft smile and a shaky voice picked up a cake for their mother who had been struggling after a difficult year. They asked Margaret if they could share the bakery's story online. Margaret shrugged. Jordan nodded. They had no idea what that would mean. That night, the customer recorded a TikTok video. It wasn't fancy. It was shaky, filmed in their kitchen with poor lighting, but it was honest. They held up the cake, cut it open, revealed the message inside. You are worth staying for. Then they told the story of the Wrong Number Bakery, of two strangers who saved each other's lives and started something beautiful from the broken pieces. The video ended with the customer wiping a tear and saying, "This is the most meaningful thing I've ever bought. This bakery deserves everything." The video went live at 8:14 p.m. By 8:22 p.m., it had 1,000 likes. By 9:00 p.m., it had 20,000. By midnight, tens of thousands of people had saved it, shared it, stitched it, and sent messages asking how to order. The notifications on their phone began buzzing nonstop, so loud and constant Jordan thought the battery might melt. Margaret stared at the screen as if it were a flare lighting up the dark. And the narrator pauses here because the truth is simple. Within 72 hours, something happened that neither of them were prepared for. The morning after the TikTok video blew up, everything in their lives shifted, subtly at first, then with the blunt force of a tidal wave. They had gone to sleep in a small house filled with dough, sketches, mismatched mugs, and the comfortable quiet of two people who had learned to breathe again. They woke to chaos. Beautiful chaos, terrifying chaos. But chaos nonetheless. By 6:00 a.m., their follower count had jumped from a few hundred to 60,000. By 9:00 a.m., they were trending. And by noon, their story appeared on the front page of Reddit under a headline that seemed too dramatic to be real. Strangers who saved each other from suicide start bakery together after wrong number text. Users devoured it, thread after thread of comments ranging from disbelief to awe to people sharing their own stories of near misses, grief, and unexpected lifelines. The virality wasn't about cake. It was about survival. People saw themselves in Margaret's loneliness, in Jordan's despair, in the impossibly lucky timing of a single wrong number that had knocked two people off the edge of fate. By the following morning, news outlets began calling, local stations first, then national ones, then international blogs with names neither Margaret nor Jordan could pronounce. One headline read, "A bakery saving lives, one hidden message at a time." Another, "From goodbye letters to baking letters, a story of healing." The attention was intoxicating, overwhelming, terrifying. Orders didn't just increase, they exploded. Hundreds became thousands. People weren't just buying cakes, they were writing confessions, apologies, hopes, messages for loved ones they didn't know how to speak to directly. Some messages were simple, "Thank you." Others were heartbreaking, "I'm trying my best." Some were, "Please, please don't leave." Margaret and Jordan found themselves at the center of something much larger than a hobby bakery. They had become, unintentionally, a symbol. And symbols, as Margaret learned, come with pressure. At first, she tried to handle the growth the way she handled everything, with quiet determination and a cup of tea. But the orders kept piling, and the stories that came with them were heavy. Heavier than flour, heavier than dough, heavier than loss. People wrote paragraphs about their depression, their grief, their fears, their last nights. And Margaret, who had barely learned to stand on her own again, absorbed each message like a sponge. Her hands began shaking in the kitchen. She cried while folding dough. She snapped at Jordan one evening for misplacing a recipe card, a tiny argument that felt like a crack in a dam. Grief resurfaced, not gently but like a wave tearing through every doorway of her rebuilt life. Late one night, leaning against the counter while the mixer hummed, Margaret whispered, "I don't know if I can handle being needed by so many people." Jordan stepped forward, but before they could speak, another crisis knocked on their door, figuratively at first, then literally. Jordan's ex-partner, the one who had left them 3 weeks before everything changed. The one whose absence had helped push Jordan onto that balcony. The one who now showed up because they had seen the viral story, recognized Jordan's face on a news clip, and decided, suddenly, disastrously, that they wanted back in. The ex messaged Jordan first, then called, then stood outside Margaret's home one night asking to talk. They said they were proud of Jordan, that they'd made a mistake, that they wanted another chance. Jordan felt the ground beneath them tilt. They weren't sure if the tremor was temptation, anger, longing, or fear. Margaret saw the confusion and stepped back, giving space she wasn't sure she wanted to give. After all, Jordan was family now, but she didn't want to interfere, not yet. And then, as if the emotional landscape wasn't unstable enough, another blow arrived, this time for Margaret. Her Sanskuld, not with congratulations, not with pride, not with warmth, but with suspicion. They had seen the news. They had read the articles. They had watched the videos, and they were not happy. They didn't like their mother's grief becoming public. They didn't trust a stranger being in her home. They didn't approve of the bakery's premise, and though they didn't say it explicitly, they didn't entirely understand or accept Jordan. Margaret, who had spent months defending silence, now found herself defending her newfound life and the person who had helped save it. The call escalated quickly. Her sons questioned her judgment. Questioned Jordan's presence, questioned the business, questioned whether she was being manipulated. Margaret, overwhelmed and exhausted, shouted for the first time in years. "You weren't here," she said, voice shaking. "You didn't see me, you didn't hear me. Jordan did, that wrong number, that stranger was the only reason I didn't drive off that bridge." Silence on the phone, a long, stunned silence. Then the accusation came, sharp and misplaced. "So you're replacing Dad?" The words hit Margaret like a blow. She hung up without responding, her chest tightening, breath slipping from her lungs. She sank onto a chair, trembling. Jordan found her minutes later, still gripping the edge of the table, trying to hold herself together. They knelt beside her, steadying her hands. But the narrator must pause here because this moment marks a turning point. Just when everything seemed perfect, both of them faced a choice that could end their friendship forever. Jordan had to decide whether to reopen the door to a relationship that once shattered them. Margaret had to decide whether to bend under the pressure of her sons' disapproval or stand firm in the life she was building. They were both being pulled in opposite directions, past versus future, fear versus growth, old loyalties versus new bonds. And as the narrator leans in, the final line of this chapter crystallizes. The confrontation that happened next would test whether their bond was real or just two broken people clinging to each other. The confrontation didn't begin with shouting. It began with a doorbell, sharp, insistent, the kind of ring that announces someone arriving with an agenda. Margaret froze mid-step, flour still dusting her hands from a morning of baking. Jordan looked up from the dining table, sensing tension that hadn't yet spoken its name. Margaret opened the door, and there they stood, her two sons. Neither had warned her they were coming, neither smiled. Their expressions carried a mix of confusion, judgment, worry, and something colder, ownership. One son stepped inside without waiting for permission. The other followed, eyes scanning the house as if assessing damage. Their gazes landed on the apron hanging on the chair, on the mismatched mugs, on Jordan's sketchbook. on the camera equipment from the viral interview, and then on Jordan. The air thickened immediately. They didn't say hello, didn't acknowledge the progress their mother had made, didn't note the warmth that had returned to the home. Instead, the eldest son asked, "Is that them?" The word them carried weight, an accusation, a dismissal. Margaret's voice shook. "They live here, I told you that on the phone." A beat of silence. Then the youngest son scoffed. "So it's true. Dad's not even gone a year and you're letting some stranger move into the house. Someone we don't know. Someone who—" He looked at Jordan from head to toe. At the hair, the piercings, the tattoos, the androgynous silhouette, the lived-in clothes of an artist who had struggled too long. "Looks like that," he finished. Jordan stiffened, fingers curling into their palms. They didn't shrink, but they didn't defend themselves either. They knew this posture too well, being judged by appearance before character. Margaret stepped protectively closer to them. Her eldest son's voice rose. "Mom, this is insane. You're letting some young person, you barely know them, stay in Dad's house, help with your business, be part of your life. Do you even hear how reckless that is?" Margaret tried to speak, but he cut her off again. "Dad's only been gone a year and you're replacing us with—" His voice cracked, bitterness spilling through. "With some stranger you met through a wrong number. Do you know how that sounds? You've known them, what, a few months, and suddenly they get your time, your house, your everything." The last word landed like a slap. Jordan swallowed hard, stepping back, trying not to absorb the blame being hurled like shrapnel. Margaret's heartbeat pounded in her ears. She knew this would come, but she hadn't expected the cruelty. The insinuation that her grief made her naive, that Jordan, sweet, broken, kind Jordan, was some predator creeping into her life under false pretenses. The youngest son crossed his arms. "What do they want, Mom? Money, a place to live, a new family. You're vulnerable, and they know it." Jordan felt the words like a direct strike to the chest. Shame rose, hot and sharp. They took a step back toward the hallway. Margaret's voice trembled, but she stood her ground. "They are not taking advantage of me," her eldest son scoffed. "Oh, really? Then why are they living here? Why are you starting a business with them? Why is our family suddenly being replaced by some kid with a sad story and rainbow hair?" That did it. Margaret's voice rose, not shaky, not hesitant, but fierce for the first time in years. "Because Jordan was there when you were." The room went silent. She kept going, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Jordan answered the phone at 2 a.m. when I couldn't breathe. Jordan sat with me when I thought I was losing my mind. Jordan helped me clean out your father's study. Jordan helped me live when I didn't want to. And where were you?" Her sons froze, neither dared look at her. "You called once a week," she continued. "Sometimes you sent flowers on my birthday, but you didn't show up, not once, not when I was breaking, not when the nights felt too long, not when the silence in this house drowned me." The eldest son bristled. "We have our own lives, Mom. You can't expect—" Margaret cut him off. "I expected nothing. That's the point. Nothing came." Jordan looked down, guilt rising. They hadn't wanted to be the wedge. They had simply wanted a life that didn't feel like drowning. The youngest son stepped forward, jaw tight. "Fine, you made your point, but we're here now and we're telling you this isn't healthy. You can't replace your husband with some roommate project. It's time to come back with us, sell the house, move closer to your family. We'll take care of you." Margaret stared at them, scrutinizing, heartbroken but clear-eyed. "No," she said. One word, sharp, final, and unexpected. Her sons recoiled as if struck. "No," the eldest repeated. "No," Margaret said. "This is my home, my life, and I'm allowed to choose who is part of it." Her sons exchanged a look, hurt, anger, disbelief blending into something ugly. "So it's them or us?" the younger demanded. Margaret's breath caught. "That is not what I said." "Feels like it," he shot back. Jordan stepped in then, voice soft but steady. "You don't have to choose, Margaret." "You shouldn't have to." Her sons glared. Jordan took a breath, shoulders trembling. "This is my fault. I never wanted to tear you away from your family. I just wanted somewhere safe. I didn't mean to take anything from you." Margaret turned sharply. "Jordan," but Jordan had already made their decision. They straightened their spine with a quiet dignity that came from surviving too much. "I'll go," they said. "I don't want to cause family problems. I don't want you to lose your sons because of me." Margaret felt the floor fall away beneath her. "Jordan, no." But they were already walking to their room, gathering their few belongings, their sketchbooks, their charger, their jacket with the enamel pins, the mug Margaret had given them. They carried them carefully, reverently, like memories too fragile to drop. Margaret's sons watched, arms crossed, convinced they had done the right thing. Jordan paused at the doorway, eyes shimmering. "Thank you," they whispered to Margaret. "For everything. I'm sorry I stayed too long." And with that, they stepped out. Margaret reached forward as if to grab their hand, but she was too late. The door closed. The house fell silent again, silent in the same hollow, suffocating way it had been before Margaret ever sent that wrong number text. And the narrator steps back, revealing the cruel symmetry. They were alone again, just like the night they first met. The days that followed unfolded in two separate timelines, parallel lives stitched together by silence, distance, and the residue of everything unspoken. The tone of their world shifted instantly. Gone was the warm noise of shared living. Gone were the late-night kitchen conversations, the smell of dough rising in the oven, the quiet hum of Jordan's music drifting down the hallway. What remained was melancholy, heavy and slow, like dust settling in a room that had just been emptied. Margaret moved through her house like someone walking through a museum of their own life. She returned to old habits instinctively, making tea for one, sitting in her quiet kitchen in the early mornings, avoiding the study despite all the progress they'd made. The walls felt emptier than before Jordan had arrived, as if something essential had been carved out of them. She left their mug on the counter for 3 days before finally placing it in a cabinet, her fingers lingering on the handle. She caught herself listening for the sound of their footsteps. The house felt bigger now, too big, too quiet, and the silence pressed against her ribs. Jordan, meanwhile, drifted between couches, friends offering space but not permanence. They insisted they didn't want to settle anywhere. They kept their belongings in a half-zipped bag. Their sketchbooks stayed stacked in a corner. Every night they slept lighter, woke earlier, and fought the nagging feeling of displacement. The business went on pause instantly. Orders piled up unanswered. The inbox filled with messages asking when Wrong Number Bakery would reopen. Jordan couldn't bring themselves to sketch a single design. Margaret couldn't bring herself to bake a single cake. They still texted, but the tone had changed. Where once their messages were confessions, warmth, late-night comfort, now they were careful, overly polite, buffered by guilt and restraint. Text from Margaret, "How's the new place?" Jordan lied. "Good, better for me, less chaotic." It wasn't chaotic with Margaret. It had been the only stable thing they'd known in years, but they couldn't say that. Text from Jordan, "You holding up okay?" Margaret lied back, "I'm fine, getting rest, focusing on myself." She wasn't sleeping, she wasn't eating properly, she wasn't focusing on anything. Their words were gentle but hollow. They were trying to protect each other, not realizing that their careful distance was quietly breaking both of them. Parallel scenes unfolded like mirror images. Margaret standing at the sink, gripping the edge of the counter while tears filled her eyes, whispering to the empty kitchen, "Why does it still hurt like this?" Jordan sitting on a friend's couch at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, replaying Margaret's voice saying you were there when they weren't, wondering if leaving had been the right choice or a catastrophic mistake. Both of them pretending to be fine, both unraveling. The lie grew heavier. Margaret told her sons she was doing better because she didn't want to give them more fuel to control her decisions. Jordan told their friends they were moving on, even though every night they typed Margaret's number into a message draft and deleted it before sending anything real. One night, Jordan's friend, Ava, who had been watching the slow collapse with increasing worry, finally intervened. She found Margaret's number from an old bakery contact form. She called. When Margaret answered, her voice was thin, cautious. Ava didn't waste time. "I'm sorry to call you like this," she said, "but we have a problem." Margaret's heart clenched. "What do you mean? Is Jordan all right?" Ava hesitated, a tiny crack before the truth poured out. "No," she said. "They're not okay. They keep saying they're fine, but they're spiraling. They won't admit it to us, and I know they won't admit it to you, but they need help, and I think they miss you more than they can handle." Margaret closed her eyes, tears forming instantly. The truth she had feared and the truth she had been trying to ignore had finally been spoken aloud. And the narrator pauses because in that moment something shifted again. The lie had broken, and the unraveling had reached its limit. Neither of them could pretend anymore. Margaret had spent her entire life avoiding conflict, softening her tone, shrinking her needs, smoothing every rough edge so others wouldn't feel discomfort. But something changed the moment Ava said the words "they're spiraling." Something inside Margaret, something steady and fierce, rose to the surface. She didn't hesitate. She called her sons and told them to come over that evening. Not asked. Told. They arrived with tight shoulders and guarded expressions, expecting another argument, but Margaret wasn't trembling this time. She stood in the living room with her back straight, a journal pressed to her chest, her chin lifted with a quiet conviction they'd never seen from her, not even when their father was alive. "Sit," she said gently. They did. Margaret exhaled, not to calm herself, but to steady the truth she was about to carry out of her chest and into the world. "I need you to listen," she began. Her voice was calm, deliberate. "Not interrupt, not defend, just listen." Her sons exchanged a look but nodded. Margaret continued. "When your father died, something inside me died too, not just grief, not just loneliness. I stopped wanting to be alive. I woke up every morning feeling like the world had already ended and I was the only one left standing in the ruins." Both sons softened, but she held up a hand. "I don't say this to guilt you. I say this because it's the truth, and the truth is I was disappearing, quietly, slowly, and you didn't notice." Younger son opened his mouth, but she stopped him again. "You called sometimes, you sent flowers, but I didn't need flowers." Her voice wavered just slightly. "I needed someone to sit with me, someone to hear me, someone to remind me I was still here." She placed David's journal on the table. A stranger did that, she said. Jordan, someone your judgment couldn't see clearly because you were too worried about how it looked. The room went still. You said I was replacing you, she continued. Said I was replacing Dad, but let me be very clear, Jordan never took your place. They just stepped into a void that was killing me. They showed up. They listened. They answered the phone at 2 a.m. when I was closer to the edge than either of you ever realized. Her sons stared at her, faces pale, guilt seeping in. And you know what else? Her voice softened, not with fragility, but with choice. You are my blood. I love you more than life, but family is not just blood. Jordan is family. They became family because they cared for me when I could not care for myself. She opened the journal, turned it to the final entry, and slid it across the table. Your father understood this before any of us did. The room fell into a hush thick enough to breathe. Her sons read silently, their father's handwriting, his last message, his plea for Margaret to keep living, to find someone who needed her, to give the love she still had. When they finished, the eldest son's face crumpled. He pressed his hands to his eyes, shaking. Mom, he whispered, voice fractured. We abandoned you because we couldn't handle our own grief. We thought you were strong. We thought you'd manage. We didn't want to face the house without Dad. We didn't want to face you without him. Tears fell unchecked. We're sorry, the younger son said, reaching for her hand. We didn't see how much you needed us. We didn't see how much Jordan mattered. Margaret took their hands gently, squeezing them with the warmth she thought she had lost months ago. I don't want to choose, she said. I want both, my children and the person who helped save your mother's life. The eldest son nodded, wiping his eyes. Then we want to meet them properly, without judgment, without assumptions. We want to make it right. Margaret smiled, a trembled smile but real, and then she picked up her phone. Her fingers hovered only for a moment, not out of fear but significance. She typed, "Come home, we have dumplings to make." And for the first time since Jordan walked out, Margaret felt the house inhale again, as if preparing for the return of something essential, something healing, something that was never meant to leave. Jordan didn't answer Margaret's text right away. They stared at it for a long time, sitting on a borrowed couch, one leg pulled against their chest, the room dim except for the glow of their phone. Come home, we have dumplings to make. 2 sentences, soft, simple, and devastating. Jordan hadn't realized how deeply they had been waiting for those words until they appeared. Their breath shook. Their fingers trembled. They typed, erased, typed again. Finally, they sent only one word, coming. The walk to Margaret's house felt heavier than any other Jordan had taken. Fear, hope, guilt, and longing braided together with every step. What if this was a mistake? What if her sons hated them? What if this reunion only scraped open wounds that hadn't healed? But then they reached the porch. Margaret was waiting at the door. She opened it before they could knock, and for the first time in weeks, Jordan saw her smile, the warm, relieved kind that made their heart ache with recognition. Neither spoke. They just stepped forward and embraced, tight, trembling, the kind of hug that says, don't disappear again. Behind Margaret, her sons watched from the living room. This time they didn't glare, they didn't scowl. The oldest stepped forward first, clearing his throat. I'm sorry, he said, words heavy but sincere, for how we treated you, for how we judged you, for not understanding what you meant to our mom. Jordan blinked, stunned. The younger son nodded. You saved her life. And we didn't even see it. We'd like to get to know you, properly. Margaret squeezed Jordan's shoulder with encouragement, so Jordan nodded, voice softer than they intended. I'd like that too. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't instant, but it was real. And then life steadily, surprisingly, began to grow. Time jump, 4 years and fast forward, the narrator shifts the tempo, the years blurring into a warm montage of growth and beginnings. Wrong Number Bakery didn't collapse under its sudden fame. With guidance from a business mentor and strong boundaries around capacity, it evolved into something sustainable. Custom orders, community events, mental health-oriented bake sales. Each cake still held a message. But now, thousands of people had their own stories baked in. Margaret, once quiet in her grief, became a voice in suicide prevention circles. She spoke at libraries, churches, community centers, her hands shaking at first, then steady, telling her story not as tragedy but as proof of the power of human connection. She never framed herself as a hero. She framed herself as someone saved by kindness. Jordan found their footing too. They began speaking at LGBTQ+ youth centers, sharing the truth that family is sometimes found, not given. They talked about chosen family, survival, art as healing, and how a wrong number could change everything. Teenagers who felt invisible saw themselves in Jordan, saw possibility. Margaret attended her first Pride parade not as a spectator, but as a participant. She marched beside Jordan, holding a sign Jordan made for her. Free mom hugs. People cried when she hugged them. Some hugged her for minutes. She never let go first. Holidays changed, too. Where once Margaret sat alone at a too large table, now she cooked for a crowd. Her sons, their spouses, Jordan's chosen family, new friends, old neighbors. The laughter rose like steam, filling the room with warmth. Margaret's sons softened too. What began as awkward politeness grew into genuine affection. They invited Jordan to family trips, asked for design advice, called when they needed someone level-headed. Trust rebuilt slowly, deliberately. Jordan taught Margaret's grandkids how to draw, how to use design tablets, how to make characters out of simple shapes. The youngest called Jordan Auntie Uncle Jojo and insisted they attend every school art fair. Jordan didn't mind the chaos. They had learned chaos could be beautiful. Together, Margaret and Jordan continued transforming the study, their creative sanctuary. They painted murals there, drafted ideas, designed packaging, tasted test batches, cried, laughed, healed. The space became a living scrapbook of their shared life. Their bond didn't replace their old lives, it expanded them. It wasn't an escape from grief or pain or loneliness. It was proof that connection can grow in the most unexpected soil. 4 years passed in this slow, intentional bloom. The wrong number text that had once saved 2 lives now anchored a network of community, found family, and purpose neither could have imagined. And yet, just when their story seemed complete, the narrator leans forward, voice dropping into a gentle promise. But there was one more chapter to their story, one that would bring everything full circle. A chapter waiting just ahead. 4 years after the night that changed everything, life surprised them again, but this time with joy. Jordan fell in love. It happened slowly, naturally, with someone kind and steady named Sam, a social worker with a quiet laugh and a way of listening that made Jordan feel fully seen. When they introduced Sam to Margaret, she studied them for exactly 3 seconds before nodding in approval. "I like this one," she whispered to Jordan later. "They look at you the way someone looks at something they intend to protect." The relationship deepened, softened, rooted itself into their lives. And when Sam proposed, hands trembling, voice cracking, Jordan didn't hesitate. They said yes with tears on their cheeks, laughter in their chest, and 1,000 memories behind them. Margaret insisted on helping plan the wedding. Not in a meddling way, but with the giddy energy of someone who'd been waiting years for a moment she wasn't sure she'd ever get to witness. She went dress and suit shopping with them, taste-tested cakes, helped manage guest lists, and designed centerpieces made of folded paper cranes and tiny handwritten quotes. She approached it with the same tenderness she used when kneading dough, patient, loving, wholly invested. But the moment that became the emotional core of this chapter happened one quiet evening, a month before the ceremony. Jordan came to Margaret's house, hands fidgeting, heart pounding. "I need to ask you something," they said, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where so much of their healing had once taken place. Margaret reached out, covering their hands with hers. "Anything," Jordan inhaled slowly. "My birth mother won't come to the wedding. She didn't even respond to the invitation." Their voice wavered, but they steadied it. "But I realized I didn't actually want her to walk me down the aisle." Margaret blinked, confused, until Jordan's expression softened into something achingly sincere. "I want you," they said. "My real mom is already here." The words hit Margaret like sunrise after a long winter, warm, overwhelming, impossible to absorb all at once. Tears filled her eyes instantly. She pressed her hand to her chest, breath trembling. "Yes," she whispered. "Of course, yes." The wedding day arrived bright and full of color. Margaret wore a mother-of-the-bride outfit Sam's family had helped her pick out, elegant, soft, and radiant on her. She walked Jordan down the aisle with a steady arm, her smile wide and unashamed, her heart full enough to ache. Jordan's vows brought the room to tears. "I was saved by a wrong number," they said. "Turns out it was exactly right." At the reception, the cake was, of course, from Wrong Number Bakery. Inside, between layers of lemon and raspberry, a message was baked into sugar script. "The night we almost gave up became the night we found everything." Later, Margaret stood to give her speech. She lifted her phone and read the text that started it all. "David, I burned the dumplings again." The room fell silent, reverent. "That message went to the wrong person," she said, voice steady, warm. But maybe the wrong person was the right miracle. And in that moment, everyone understood. A single text had become a family, a business, a purpose, and now a wedding. 5 years have passed since the wrong number that changed 2 lives forever. Margaret is 67 now, still spry, still stubborn, still wearing her cardigan like armor and comfort. Jordan is 33, married, fulfilled, and living in the same house where a stranger once opened the door and saved them without realizing it. Sam fits into the rhythm of the home effortlessly, 3 hearts moving in harmony, each carrying a history of pain that grew somehow into purpose. The bakery still thrives, but that's no longer the headline of their lives. The real success, the real legacy, is quieter and far more powerful. There is the Wrong Number Hotline, a community-funded project Margaret and Jordan launched for people who feel alone late at night. Volunteers answer with warmth, patience, and the kind of understanding that only comes from having been on the edge themselves. Hundreds of lives have been touched, redirected, softened, and every call begins with the same greeting. Hi, you're not alone, talk to me. There are the stories, thousands of them now, of people who have writ to thank Margaret and Jordan for helping them feel less invisible. People who found friendship, love, family, purpose, or simply one more reason to stay. There is Margaret herself, traveling for the first time in her life, teaching workshops in small towns, sharing her dumpling recipe with people who hug her afterward like she's family. She laughs more now, lives louder, breathes easier. And Jordan, whose art once lived in sketchbooks, now has pieces displayed in galleries, murals in community centers, and illustrations in best-selling cookbooks. Their career blossomed not from ambition, but from authenticity. But the story comes full circle in a much smaller way. The final scene finds them back at the original Maple Street coffee shop, the same table where grief once trembled in their hands. Today, they're waiting for someone new, someone who sent a message last night that sounded far too familiar, far too fragile. Margaret smiles warmly as the young person approaches. "We have room for one more at the table," she says, because of course they do. And as the narrator closes the chapter, one last truth settles gently. Margaret still texts David's old number sometimes. But now she knows someone, always listening, even if it's just herself, reminding herself how far she's come. A new message appears on the screen late at night, from an unknown number trembling with need. "I think I have the wrong number, but I really need someone to talk to tonight." Margaret reads it, her heart steady, her purpose clear. She types back without hesitation, "You have exactly the right number." A soft pause. Then the final reminder rises like a gentle light.